Let's talk about a conflict that was absolutely brutal, a war that really became the first major battleground of the Cold War. It pitted superpowers against each other on this tiny peninsula, cost millions of lives, and get this, it never technically ended. We're going to unpack the incredible story of the Korean War. For a war this huge, one that had such a massive impact on the world, it has this really strange nickname, the Forgotten War. It's almost like it's been squeezed out of our memory, overshadowed by World War II right before it and the Vietnam War right after. So, that's really the big question we're tackling today. How does a war that killed more than 3 million people just fade away? We're going to follow the insane back and forth of the fighting to understand why this war, with no clear winner and no real ending, doesn't stick in our minds, even though it's still shaping our world right now. All right, so here's how we'll do it. We've broken it down into 6 parts. We'll start with how Korea got split in 2, then the North's surprise invasion, the incredible UN counterattack, China's game-changing intervention, the awful stalemate that followed, and finally, the war's unfinished business. Okay, first up, a nation divided. To really get the Korean War, you have to know that it didn't just start in 1950. Nope, the roots of this thing go all the way back to the end of World War II. So, picture this. Japan surrenders in 1945. 2 American colonels get handed a map and are told they have 30 minutes, just 30 minutes, to find a spot to temporarily divide Korea between the US and the Soviets. They just picked a line on the map, the 38th parallel. But that temporary line, it got permanent, fast. By 1948, you had 2 totally separate hostile states, the communist DPRK in the north and the capitalist ROK in the south. And here's the thing, both claim to be the one true government of all of Korea. So when the last American and Soviet troops packed up and left in 1949, they left behind a ticking time bomb. And on June 25th, 1950, that time bomb went off. The North Korean People's Army launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel, kicking off a war that would swing back and forth with just shocking violence. And just look at this imbalance. It is stark. The North, with all this gear from the Soviet Union, had way more troops, but the real difference maker? Tanks and planes. The South had 0 tanks. 0. And just a handful of trainer planes against the North's Soviet-made T-34s and fighter jets. The South Korean army was simply not equipped for this kind of fight. The result was, well, a total disaster for the South. The North Korean army captured the capital, Seoul, in just 3 days. 3 days. Over the next couple of months, they just rolled over everything, pushing the South Koreans and the first UN troops all the way down into this tiny little corner of the country. They were literally trapped in what became known as the Pusan perimeter, just holding on for dear life. It honestly looked like the war was over before it even really began. But then, the seesaw swung hard in the complete opposite direction. The UN command, led by the Americans, was about to pull off one of the riskiest, most incredible military operations you'll ever hear about. The UN commander, General Douglas MacArthur, came up with this masterstroke of a plan, a giant amphibious landing at Incheon, which was the port city for Seoul. It was an insane gamble. The tides were treacherous, the terrain was awful, but it was also completely brilliant. On September 15th, UN forces stormed the beaches hundreds of miles behind the front lines and caught the North Koreans totally by surprise. It was devastating for them. It cut off their supply lines and trapped their main army, which was still stuck fighting down at the Pusan perimeter. And just like that, the entire war was turned on its head. UN forces broke out of Pusan, took back Seoul, and they just kept going. They crossed back over the 38th parallel, captured the northern capital of Pyongyang, and were racing toward the Yalu River, the border with China. Now it was the North Korean army that was completely shattered. It looked like Korea would be unified under the South any day now. But as those UN forces got closer and closer to the Chinese border, they had no idea they were walking right into a trap. The war was about to change again, and this time it was going to be more brutal than anyone could have imagined. I mean, listen to this quote from MacArthur just weeks before China jumped in. This just perfectly shows how fatally overconfident that UN command was. China had been sending warnings, but MacArthur was just convinced they wouldn't dare get involved. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. So while MacArthur was busy dismissing the threat, more than 200,000 Chinese soldiers were already marching into North Korea. They did it completely in secret, only moving at night, hiding and camouflaging themselves during the day. This massive army got into position without UN reconnaissance spotting a single thing. And in late November, they attacked. Human waves of Chinese troops just slammed into the completely surprised and overstretched UN forces in the freezing cold mountains. It triggered this desperate, chaotic retreat all the way back down the peninsula, past Pyongyang, past Seoul again. It actually became the longest retreat in American military history. The seesaw had swung all the way back. So after all that chaos, the Chinese intervention, the frantic retreats, the counterattacks, the war of movement just stopped. The fast-moving seesaw got stuck, and the whole thing turned into a static, bloody, grinding war. For the next 2 years, the front lines basically froze right back where the whole thing started, around the 38th parallel. The fighting turned into this grim World War I-style nightmare. Both sides dug these huge trench systems, and they fought these awful battles for tiny, strategically useless hills. And the names of those hills tell you everything you need to know. Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. You can really see the nature of this stalemate in the numbers. The UN had this massive advantage in firepower. In just one 3-month period in 1952, they fired almost 10 times more artillery shells than the Chinese and North Koreans. It was a war where nobody was gaining any ground, but the amount of pure destruction was just off the charts. After 2 years of just beating each other senseless in this stalemate, both sides were totally exhausted. The peace talks, which had been dragging on forever, finally came to an end. But the war left behind a legacy of just unimaginable devastation. The human cost was just astronomical. We're talking about 3 million people killed in only 3 years. And what's truly shocking is that at least half of them were civilians. That's a higher percentage of civilian deaths than in World War II. For the Korean people, this war was an absolute catastrophe. And the physical destruction was just as bad. The U.S. dropped more bombs on the Korean Peninsula than it did in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Think about that. Pretty much every city in both North and South Korea was turned to rubble. By the time the fighting stopped, North Korea was one of the most heavily bombed countries in the history of the world. And this right here, this is the key to why this war is still so important today. On July 27, 1953, they signed an armistice. But an armistice is just a ceasefire. It's a temporary stop to the fighting. It is not a peace treaty. The war was put on pause, not officially ended. That armistice froze the battle lines exactly where they were, and it created the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. It's this 2.5-mile-wide strip of no man's land that for over 70 years has been the border between North and South Korea. It is a very real, very physical reminder of this unfinished war, and it's the most heavily armed border on the planet. Which brings us all the way back to today. This war set the pattern for decades of Cold War conflict. It's the root of the North Korean nuclear crisis, and it has locked one people into 2 completely different, tragic realities. So how does this so-called forgotten war still cast such a long and powerful shadow over all of us? You know, the lessons that were learned, and maybe the ones that weren't learned, in Korea directly influenced what happened in the next major Cold War showdown. To see what I mean, you should check out our explainer on the Vietnam War. It's right here in the playlist. And if you want to keep digging into complex stuff like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.